Did you know that there is a cardinal by the name of Pizzaballa? That is my vote for the next Pope. And his name reminds me of Mr. Ballen. If you ring this bell, you're already dead. All right, what is this about here? Let's jump right into the story. What the heck?
Today's story is about one of the most haunted rooms in the world and what happens when you go inside of it. Now, this particular account is from 200 years ago, but the legend of what goes on inside of that room is still very much alive today. However, before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do,
Yes.
and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's bathroom and replace their toothpaste with Novocaine. Also, please subscribe to our channel.
I can do that,
and turn
of
on
course.
all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay?
While we're at it, guys, go ahead and give this video a like. Thank you.
Let's get into today's story.
The nameless thing. That's
Late
so
one
vague.
evening in 1840, a 30-year-old British nobleman named Sir Robert Warboys stood next to 5 of his closest friends on the front porch of a townhome in one of the fanciest neighborhoods in London, England. The address of this townhome was 50 Berkeley Square, and it was one of dozens of these beautiful brick and marble townhomes that surrounded this big garden. The whole square had been built about 100 years earlier, and since then it had become one of the most fashionable places for the rich and famous.
Fashionable.
However, Robert and his friends had not come here to rub shoulders with important people. Instead, Robert had come here to win a bet. So Robert actually was a nobleman. He was like this proper guy, at least on paper. But in reality, at least to his friends, he had a total wild streak. He loved taking on dares. Basically, anytime anybody, challenged him to do something, he would do it, especially
A YouTuber ahead of his time, if you will.
if there was money on the line. But it wasn't really about the money. It wasn't about, winning money by doing these different things. He just loved the challenge. He loved the thrill of
Doing
taking
it for the
chances.
sport.
So that night,
What a
on the
Chad.
front porch of this townhome, Robert turned and knocked on the front door. And then as soon as he did, he turned back and looked at his friends and grinned at them. And he saw some of them looked really excited and some looked pretty nervous. But to Robert, he was purely happy about how things were going so far, because he knew, come tomorrow when this whole thing was done and he had won his bet, he would have a great story to tell. A few seconds later, the front door of the townhome swung open and this middle-aged man stepped outside. His name was Charles Benson, and while Robert and Charles did know each other, they were not close friends. They actually only knew each other because they both were members of the same exclusive gentlemen's club in London. Plus,
The
pretty much everybody in
Gentlemen's
London
Club.
had at least heard of Charles, because of all the rumors swirling around about what went on inside of his townhome. Even though Robert had told Charles that on this night he and his buddies were coming to his townhome for this bet, even though he had clearly told him, Charles still seemed very surprised to see Robert standing there. But Robert nonetheless was like, "Hey Charles, how are you? I'm here for the bet." And Charles basically didn't react. He just stared at Robert with this very concerned look on his face and just said, "Are you sure you really want to do this?" And Robert, who knew what he was referencing, just kind of looked down at the pistol on his hip and said, "Yeah, I'm sure." A few minutes later, Robert and his 5 friends were inside of Charles' townhome in the dining room, sitting around a table, while Charles had gone upstairs to get something. And as they sat there, Robert kind of looked around the room at his friends, and he could tell they were clearly more nervous about this than he was. And so he tried to, keep the mood light by making some jokes and kind of downplaying what he was about to do. But it was like no matter what he did, he could just tell his friends were very uneasy about what was going to happen here. And then a moment later, they heard the sound of Charles coming down the stairs. And Charles came in the kitchen, still with a very serious look on his face. And he walked up to them and he reached in his pocket and he pulled out this old iron key and he placed it in the middle of the table. And as soon as he did that, the room went completely silent. Everybody just stared at this key. And then Charles eventually broke the silence and explained to the group that over the last 10 years of living in this townhome, he had only used that key maybe 2 or 3 times total. And when the key was not in use, Charles said he actually hid the key just to make sure it never wound up in the wrong hands. But now, again with that somber look on his face, Charles looked over at Robert and said, "If you're really sure about this, the key is yours to take." And Robert, with no hesitation, reached out and snatched the key, showing his friends and showing Charles that
Charles wasn't even done with his speech. He's like, all right, give me the key.
he was not about to get cold feet. A couple of minutes later, all the men stood up from the dining room table, and then Charles led the group up the thin, narrow, creaky staircase to the second floor. And when they got to the second floor, Charles led them down this narrow hallway that came to a stop in front of this closed door. At this point, all 7 men were kind of crowded together right in front of this door. But it was obvious that even though Charles lived in this townhome, he was sort of hesitant to get even close to this door. Like he really didn't want to be anywhere near
What
it.
is in
Also,
there?
all of Robert's friends were sort of reacting the same way too. I mean, they were the ones that actually dared Robert to do this in the first place. But now that they were actually here, about to go through with it, they were looking at Robert like he was totally insane. And also they were kind of hoping that, maybe he would just back out and they could just leave. But Robert did not seem remotely like he was about to back out. He had a very determined look on his face, and as everybody else was kind of cowering away from this door, Robert stepped up, reached into his pocket, pulled out that iron key, and put it into the lock.
What do you guys think? I mean, well, maybe you already saw the video, but what did you think before you heard what was in there? What did you think was in there? Right now, I really have no idea. I'm gonna say a mummy, but that's just, kind of random, but I have no idea. A mummy.
And as he began to turn the lock, everybody else took steps farther away from him. And then he pulled open the door, and as he did, everybody gasped, and Robert even took a step backwards. But when Robert actually looked through the now open doorway, he just laughed, because it was just a normal bedroom. It was filled with all this old but very expensive looking furniture. On one side of the room was this big wooden dresser with a huge round mirror above it, and then on the opposite side of the room was this big 4-poster bed. And right above this bed, dangling down from the ceiling, was this red ribbon. Now, Robert knew that in a rich nobleman's house, there were ribbons like this one that are known as bell pulls. A nobleman could pull on that lever, and it was connected to a pulley system that rang a bell down in the servants' quarters.
Butler.
And when the servant heard that bell, they would see what room it was coming from, and they would go up to the room to see what the nobleman needed. And so after taking in the sight of this bedroom, Robert took a confident step into the room. And as soon as he did, Charles reached out and grabbed him by the wrist and said, "Hey, Robert, this is your last chance to change your mind. Are you sure you want to go through with this?" And Robert kind of looked back at his friends and smiled and said, "I'm sure. I'll see you guys tomorrow morning once I've won the bet." Then Robert released Charles's grip on his wrist.
He has to stay overnight. That's completely different.
Walked into the room, turned, shut, and locked the door. At this moment, Robert's friends didn't really know what to do. They were still sort of shocked that Robert was actually going through with this. I mean, even by his standards, this felt particularly reckless. They also felt kind of guilty. I mean, they were the ones who ultimately put him up to this. So, if Robert got hurt, which in theory could actually happen here, it would be partially their fault. And so Robert's friends turned to Charles to see what he was thinking. And Charles had this very grave, resigned expression on his face. And he just told them, "I have one more thing to show you before we go to bed." So Robert's friends followed Charles back down the hallway, down the stairs, past the dining room, towards the very back of the townhome. And when they got there, they found there was sort of like a studio apartment area back there. There was a kitchen area, a laundry area, and there were several beds. Charles explained this was where his servants lived and worked, but he had given them all the night off, because he knew it was possible that Robert and his friends would be here for this bet, and they would need a place to stay. Charles pointed to a space right above the beds where there was this row of all these bells in a horizontal line. Each of these bells were connected to various bell pulls throughout the house, and he pointed to one particular bell and told them that that was the one that was connected to the bell pull in the room Robert was staying in tonight. And so he said it was their job tonight to constantly monitor that bell all night. So somebody had to be awake all night listening to that bell, because heaven forbid if Robert pulls that bell, that was going to be the signal that something bad had happened in that room. And so
I feel like you don't have to stay awake. You can just sleep, and if you hear the bell, then you go to Robert.
Job was basically to be on guard all night to potentially run up and rescue Robert if he needed it.
What if he just wanted some dessert? And he rings
Last
the bell.
year, we launched our very first graphic novel.
Here's the
and
act.
it went great. I mean, it made the New York Times bestseller list, so thank you all so much for making that happen. But ever since this book came out, we have been hit with so many questions about, hey, when are you gonna do another graphic novel? When's book 2 coming out? Well, I have an announcement to make. Check it out. We are doing a second graphic novel, and this is the official cover art. Here it is. This is MrBallen Presents
Nice.
Where Nightmares Live. It's gonna have another set of 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, and it comes out September 30th. But you can pre-order it right now if you go to book.ballenstudios.com. Also, there's a link right here and in the description below. There are some signed copies available, but they will go quickly. So please head on over to book.ballenstudios.com to pre-order a copy of our newest graphic novel. I know you're gonna love it. Check it out. Your nightmares are waiting.
I would, but I haven't read a book in years.
Around 3 hours later, all of Robert's friends were sitting on the floor in the servants' quarters playing blackjack. It was almost midnight, and all of them were exhausted, but they were too on edge to sleep. They were so focused on this bell, and they were so worried about Robert and, wondering if he was really okay up there. And they also had become convinced that, maybe the bell would ring and they wouldn't hear it if they were making too much noise. And so they had made this decision to silently play blackjack and just focus exclusively on this bell. But it had really created a lot of extra tension in the room. They're basically all just staring at the bell, dealing one hand after another, paranoid it would go off, and wondering what would even happen if it did. And so hand after hand, the friends are playing blackjack, anxiously watching this bell being completely silent. And then suddenly they hear this sound that makes them all jump. But it wasn't the bell. It was a blood-curdling scream coming from upstairs. And for a moment, the friends just sat there in shock. And then they got up and began running out of the servants' quarters to see what was going on. And as they did, Robert's bell began ringing furiously, so loud it hurt their ears. And so they charge out of the servants' quarters and literally bump into Charles, who also is coming to figure out what's going on. And as a group, they begin running up the stairs to the second floor. And all the while, the bell is ringing furiously. There's screams coming from Robert's bedroom, and by the time they got to the second floor, suddenly everything went silent. The ringing stopped, the screaming stopped, they're in the second floor in that hallway, and it's just deadly silent, and up ahead of them is that closed door. And so Charles and the group, they begin walking down the hall, having no idea what to expect, and right as they're about to reach the door, they hear this loud bang sound. And then silence again. Seconds later, Robert's friends were at that door, pounding on it, screaming for Robert, come open the door, because Robert was the only one with the key. But Robert wasn't making any noise. The room was still totally silent. And so eventually the friends began kicking on this door to try to break it down. All the while, Charles is just kind of standing back in the hallway, watching this horrible thing unfold. And then finally, the friends manage to literally kick the door in. I mean, it's a 100-year-old house. The door gets kicked in, and the friends stumble into the room, and they look over towards the bedroom, and they all just freeze in shock. When Charles bought this townhome 10 years earlier, it came with a very dark backstory. The previous owner had apparently kept his violent and psychotic brother locked up inside of this second floor bedroom where Robert was. And after this brother died inside of this room, all these strange and frightening things began happening inside of this room. People began hearing these awful wailing sounds coming out of this room when nobody was in there. And then they'd go into the room and the wailing would stop, but furniture had been moved all around the room, even though, again, no one had been in there to do that. And then also, people began seeing this sort of amorphous gray figure sort of moving around inside of that room, especially at night, kind of slinking up against the wall and across the floor.
Paranormal
and even though nobody
activity.
had any idea what it was, it just felt like it was evil. And so they began calling it the nameless thing, and they referred to it as the physical manifestation of evil. However, not everybody believed this story. In fact, one person who absolutely did not believe the story was Robert Warboys. He thought this was just a tall tale designed to scare people. And so when his friends dared him to spend one night inside of that bedroom where supposedly the nameless thing lived, he happily accepted, because to him, it didn't seem risky at all. Spending one night in the haunted room was no big deal because it's not actually haunted. He'd be fine. And anyways, it would make for a great story to tell down at the Gentleman's Club. Unfortunately,
Except
though,
it wasn't.
the night in that bedroom did not go as Robert hoped. When Robert's friends burst through the bedroom door and looked inside, the first thing they noticed was the bell pull, the ribbon from the ceiling, had been yanked out of the ceiling, and Robert's pistol was on the ground next to the bed. And then on the other side of the room, there was a very obvious bullet hole in the wall. And so that was the loud bang sound they heard as they were coming down the hall. It was the pistol going off. And then there was Robert. Robert was laying on the bed, and he was totally rigid, and he actually was still clutching the red ribbon from the bell pull. And as they stared at him, they saw his eyes were wide open and bloodshot, and his lips were kind of pulled back in this horrible grimace with his teeth exposed. And for a second, his friends thought Robert must be having a seizure of some kind. That's why he was so tight on the bed like that. And so they ran to him, trying to snap him out of it. But as soon as they touched him, they realized that the reason he was rigid was not because of a seizure. It was because Robert was dead. That night, Charles would call the local coroner, who would come by and take Robert's body, and also
with his eyes wide open.
He would open up an official inquest into Robert's death to figure out what had happened to him. And the verdict of this inquest was that Robert had died from massive heart failure caused by unknown circumstances. But to Charles and all of Robert's friends who were there that night and actually saw Robert in the room, it seemed plainly obvious that what had happened here was Robert had come in contact with the so-called nameless thing in that room, and it literally scared him to death. In the nearly 200 years since Robert's death, 50 Berkeley Square has had many different owners, and virtually all of them have reported either seeing, feeling, or hearing some sort of malevolent, ghostly presence inside of that second floor bedroom. To this day, that particular bedroom, where the nameless thing apparently resides, is considered one of the most haunted places in the entire world.
First time hearing of this. Oh no.
In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, MrBallen Presents.
No, yes, you already told us. Wow. I'm surprised that this is allegedly a true story. I had never heard of that room, that house, and I've seen a lot of stuff about haunted places throughout the world. They still have that estate with the room, like they haven't knocked it down or done anything with it. It would be cool to visit. I mean, it's modern day. You would think that, some ghost hunters, paranormal investigators from today could just go to the house, put some cameras around, audio equipment, right? Recorders and stuff like that, and just monitor the room, right? It's not like they have to try it out for themselves and somebody has to sleep over. Just put some cameras on there. Why hasn't that been done? What's the hold up here? See, if I were, and we're getting carried away, but if I were a billionaire, somebody with loads of money, infinite money, if you will, like some, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, I would just pursue my interests in this way. And some of them, I feel like no billionaire has ever pursued the area of paranormal, right? They've done like investigating outer space, the oceans, whatever. But like, you have so much money. Like, this is what I'm saying. Like, you could literally, with, a few $1,000s, that for them would be nothing. Just literally monitor the heck out of these haunted places and see what you catch. I think that's what I would do, including this room. Very interesting story. Thank you guys for watching. If you have more suggestions, comment down below. Hit the like, subscribe, and at the end, do a flip. Till the next.